these objectives pertain to the higher level paper only. At the end of this section, you should be able to understand ecological relationships and the factors that control populations. You should be able to define and give one example of competition, predation, parasitism, and symbiosis. What does this actually mean? What are we trying to understand? We're trying to understand the factors or the things that control populations or the number of organisms in a habitat. We have to define the terms competition, predation, parasitism, and symbiosis. There is no point in going into these examples until we understand what they mean. However, we have to give a description of one example in each case. Let's battle on. We're going to approach the learning of our ecology definitions or ecology terms like you would approach the learning of a new language. When you learn a new language, you have to learn your vocabulary. When you know your vocabulary, you can put it together and speak the language. The same thing here. When you learn your ecology definitions, you can put them together and then you can speak the language of ecology. It is vital to learn your definitions, therefore, and make sure you understand what they mean. A population is a group of organisms of the same species living in an area. We can speak about a population of pine trees in a woodland, along with a population of rabbits and a population of foxes. There are a number of factors or things that control populations. When we look at these, the sharp-eyed amongst you might spot that they are a repetition of the biotic factors that we met already. The factors that affect populations tend to be factors to do with relationships. There's one little twist here. This time we are going to focus in on the factors that affect the population of humans, like war, famine, contraception, and disease, whereas previously we were focused on the idea of how humans act as biotic factors and affect organisms in the ecosystem. We are interested in how these factors work to control the population numbers or the number of organisms in the ecosystem or habitat. The factors that control populations act on the birth rate and the death rate. When these factors act on the birth rate, they cause more organisms or offspring to be produced, or maybe fewer to be produced. When these factors act on the death rate, they cause more organisms to die, or maybe fewer to die. In affecting birth and death rates, these factors help to maintain a balance of nature, or a balance in population numbers. This allows the population to stay close to the number of organisms that the habitat can support. Basically, the population numbers stay steady. The balance of nature makes sure that the numbers of different types of species in a habitat stays constant over time. What is competition? The first factor that affects population numbers. Competition is where organisms actively struggle for a resource that's in short supply. We have to be very careful here. If you're asked the definition of competition in the exam, you have to include the key point or the key words of actively struggle for the resource that is in short supply. If you leave out these key points, you might not get full marks. Plants compete for resources like water, space, and light and minerals, and animals compete for resources like territory, shelter, water or food. Now, intra-specific competition takes place between members of the same species. A in same, A in intra. While technically speaking, this term, intra-specific, is not on the biology syllabus, it is no harm for you to have it in your back pocket. Intra-specific competition might be our friends the rabbits competing with each other for food. Inter-specific competition takes place between members of different species, ER in different and ER in inter. An example of inter-specific competition would be where the grass and the daisies compete out on the lawn for light. At the end of the day, however, the consequence or the result of competition is that the number of organisms is reduced. The population levels go down. Don't forget, you must always relate the factor in question back to either the birth rate or the death rate. And in this particular case, competition increases the death rate. Now, there are two types of competition that we have to know. The first type is contest competition, and the second type is scramble competition. What do these mean? Well, contest competition is a direct fight between two organisms which allows one to win the resource. There is an active physical contest between the two individual organisms. Competition results in one organism getting the resource while the other organism is left without it. Loser. Scramble competition is a struggle between two organisms where each organism tries to get as much of the resource as possible. Scramble competition may mean that none of the individuals or the organisms will get as much of the resources they need, and they might not be able to grow properly nor reproduce either. Scramble competition tends to reduce the numbers in a population. A good example of contest competition is the way in which animals, like our deer here, or our friends the robins, would defend an area or a territory. By displaying such behaviour, only the fittest animals are left to reproduce. This helps to improve the species. However, though, contest competition in general reduces population resources because only one will win the resource and the other will lose out. As we said, scramble competition reduces population numbers because no individual gets enough. Our example of scramble competition would be cows eating grass. If the cows are left in the field, they will compete with one another for the grass, which will get in short supply, and neither organism will have enough to reproduce efficiently, or they might not be able to grow properly. The same applies to overcrowded seedlings. In this example here, we can see strawberry plants that are asexually reproducing by means of runners. Unfortunately, due to scramble competition, unless some of the seeds or plantlets are taken away, none of them will get enough resources. They will all grow poorly and they'll fail to flower or get seeds. Therefore, it is terribly important that organisms should avoid competition if they are to survive. They do this by adapting to their environments. They might have to change their feeding habits or occupy different food niches. For example, the adult butterfly will feed on flowers and on their nectar, whereas the young of the butterfly, the caterpillar, will chew and gnaw on plants. Different plants living in the same area also have different adaptations to survive competition. So, for example, the grass roots are fibrous roots and will tend to be at the surface of the soil and will absorb water from the surface, whereas other plants like dandelions or carrots have tap roots which tunnel through the ground and will absorb water from deeper levels. This will allow both organisms to avoid competition with each other for water and will allow both to survive in the same lawn, for example. Another adaptation is where plants have adapted their methods of seed dispersal, making use of wind dispersal or animal dispersal or self-dispersal. These adaptations allow the organisms to survive competition. The second factor that affects population numbers is predation. Predation is the catching, killing, and eating of another organism. Very important definition. The predator is the animal that catches, kills, and eats another organism, whereas the prey is the animal that is killed and eaten. These two terms are often confused, but there's no excuse. Sure, you'd pray for mercy. There are many examples of predators and their prey. The most obvious one is the lion and the poor antelope. In everyday life, we would be familiar with the idea of a ladybird. She is a predator, not a nice creature at all, preying on the poor greenfly or the aphid. We also have another garden example where we have the blackbird, the predator, preying or eating the earthworm. Again, predators have many adaptations that improve their efficiency. Perhaps they might have sharp teeth, like the lion here. He's an example of a carnivore, having canines for tearing meat. The predators may be well camouflaged. Perhaps they have striped fur so that you can't see them in the undergrowth. Where is that tiger? Other predators have good sight. Some of them are able to turn their heads 360 degrees and look right behind them. Others might have very sharp claws. Prey also have many adaptations to avoid being eaten. They might have camouflage. Where is that frog? Eyes on the side of the head so that they can see the predator coming up behind them. They might have warning coloration. White and black are warning colours in nature, like the red and the white and the black on the ladybird, or the black and the yellow of the wasp. These all send out a warning, or they flag the issue that I am not nice to eat or I am smelly, so keep away from me. Another adaptation that prey often show is that they travel in groups. If you travel in a group, you are going to be more protected than traveling on your own. Surely you won't be the one that's picked on. What's interesting here is that the predator-prey relationship can be used for population control. We can see the use of a predator-prey relationship in biological pest control, where you would use one organism to control the numbers of another. Because don't forget, competition usually results and predation usually results in an increase in death rate. So if we use the ladybird to control the levels of greenfly on our rose bushes, this would be an example of biological pest control where we're interested in keeping down the numbers of greenfly. Parasitism is where one organism, the parasite, lives in or on another organism. You can have internal parasites or you can have external parasites. So the parasite lives in or on another organism known as the host, causing it harm. Now this definition is absolutely vital to learn off properly because it comes up in a number of areas on the course. The idea is that we're living in or on the other organism, causing it harm. Now parasites often weaken the host, but they do not kill it. So the rabbit might be riddled with fleas, but it might not be killed. Therefore, parasites usually don't significantly reduce the numbers of their host, or they don't have a big effect on death rate. Remember, we have to keep coming back to birth or death rate. However, there is an exception. Disease-causing organisms, like disease-causing bacteria and viruses, like the potato blight fungus, these disease-causing organisms can reduce population numbers, like the potato blight, wiping out the potato crop, or the disease-causing organism, the coronavirus, causing so many deaths. Ectoparasites live on the outside of the host. Ecto meaning outside, so we had ectoplasm and ectoderm before. Now, strictly speaking, according to the syllabus, we don't really need to know these definitions. However, again, there's no harm to have them in your back pocket. An example of an ectoparasite would be a mosquito on your skin, would be a flea living on a dog, or the green fly on a rose. This is a very useful example because later in practical work, if we are going to study the school garden, this would be a very good example of parasites in the habitat. Green fly on the rose bushes or green fly on the grass leaves. Endoparasites live inside the host. Endo meaning inside, like we had endoplasm before. An example of an endoparasite would be a tapeworm in humans that can live in your intestines, or blight, the potato blight disease caused by the potato blight fungus living in the potato plant. The potato blight fungus lives in the plant and absorbs food from the plant cells. Or you might also have the liver fluke worm, a flatworm, that lives in the bile duct of sheep. Symbiosis is the fourth factor that has an effect on population numbers. This definition is absolutely vital. Symbiosis is where two different organisms live in close association and at least one of them benefits. Symbiosis means living together. It's almost a case of you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. Again, don't forget that these factors have to be related back to either the birth rate or the death rate. So symbiosis increases the numbers of both organisms involved in the relationship. Now, there are a couple of subtle points that we have to keep in mind here. In this course, symbiosis is given a separate heading and discussed separately from parasitism. However, when you look closely, parasitism is where an organism lives in or on another organism, causing it harm. So in that relationship, one organism, the parasite, is benefiting while the host is being harmed. So if you like, parasitism should really be a subheading under the idea of symbiosis. Because when you look at symbiosis, the definition is where two different organisms live in close association and at least one of them benefits. So that takes care, or it acts as an umbrella for the definition of a parasite. Keep a sharp eye on this concept. Strictly speaking, there are a number of different types of symbiosis. Parasitism, as we just discussed, mutualism, and commensalism. Let's take a quick look at each of these. As a reminder, the definition of parasitism is very important. It's where one organism, the parasite, lives in or on another organism, the host, causing it harm. The other types of symbiosis are mutualism and commensalism. Now, mutualism is a relationship where both organisms benefit in a symbiotic relationship. It makes a little bit of sense. They are mutually or both of them benefiting. The other relationship is where one organism benefits and the other one is actually unharmed. Now, strictly speaking, neither of these two terms feature on the biology syllabus. However, for the sake of being able to cope with more challenging questions, it might be no harm to have these in your back pocket either. The reason for this is very simple, because we have met these examples before. We have met the cellulose digesting bacteria that live in your intestines, and this was an example of symbiosis. The actual type of symbiosis we now understand is mutualism, and in this relationship the humans get food from the bacteria because they break the cellulose down into sugar, and the bacteria get food and shelter from the humans. There are also bacteria living in our large intestine. This is an example of symbiosis again. Again, we now understand it is mutualism because both organisms benefit. Humans get vitamin B and vitamin K, which we need for clotting our blood, from these bacteria, and in return the bacteria get shelter. What's interesting here is babies, when they are born, do not have enough of these bacteria in their large intestine to produce vitamin K for them. Therefore, babies are given a dose of vitamin K shortly after being born to help ensure that their blood will clot. We also had the symbiotic relationship between bacteria and clover nodules. Clover nodules are little swellings, I call them chambers, C for chambers, C for clover. And these nodules or swellings on the clover roots act as a chamber or an area where bacteria live. The bacteria get food in the form of sugar and shelter from the clover plant, and the plant in return will get nitrates. This has a very strong link into the nitrogen cycle, where the nitrogen-fixing bacteria live in the nodules of the clover plant, and they are able to convert the atmospheric nitrogen into nitrates, which is a form that the plants can use. Remember, I'll fix you and make something useful out of you. Nitrogen fixation, carried out by nitrogen-fixing bacteria that live in the nodules of the clover plant. A vitally important concept, very important example, and make sure that we understand it because it can be used in many places in the course. Lichens or lichens, whatever way you like to pronounce them, are another example of a symbiotic relationship. These tend to grow on walls, on the roofs of houses, on the trunks of trees. To be honest, they look on occasion like big blobs of chewing gum. They are actually a symbiotic relationship. They are a symbiotic relationship between a fungus and an algae. Now the fungus gets food, so F for fungus, F for food, from the algae. The algae can possibly make it through chemosynthetic reactions, and the algae gets protection from the fungus. Lastly, we have some more examples of symbiosis, in this case, commensalism, where one organism is living on another organism, but it is not causing harm. So, for example, barnacles live on whales. You can see them on the whale's tail here. Sometimes you might see them stuck on the bottom of a boat. And the barnacles get transported to different parts of the ocean. They are carried there by the whale and they cause the whale no harm. In our ecosystem, birds will feed on the insects that are stirred up by the grazing cattle. The birds cause no harm to the cattle. So they live in a symbiotic relationship where the birds are benefiting and the other organism is not being harmed. The most useful example here, which we can make use of in our practical work, is the idea that birds get a place to nest on the trees but the trees are not actually harmed. An example of a symbiotic relationship where one organism benefits but the other isn't harmed. Now that we have arrived at the end of the lesson, have we achieved our objective? Can you understand ecological relationships and the factors that control populations? Can you define and give one example of competition, predation, parasitism, and symbiosis?